Language Foundations Vocabulary Flashcards, helping you achieve understanding.
The act of keeping something within specified bounds, by force if necessary. The restriction of the infection to a focal area. An act of limiting or restricting, as by regulation. A principle that limits the extent of something. I am willing to accept certain restrictions on my movements. The act of keeping something within specified bounds, by force if necessary. Concluding state of pregnancy. From the onset of contractions to the birth of a child. The act of restraining of a person's liberty by confining them. The state of being confined. He was held in confinement. An act of limiting or restricting, as by regulation. A principle that limits the extent of something. The greatest amount of something that is possible or allowed. It is growing rapidly with no limitation in sight. Law. A time period after which suits cannot be brought. Statute of limitations. The quality of being limited or restricted. It is a good plan, but it has serious limitations. The state of being physically constrained. Dogs should be kept under restraint. Lack of ornamentation. The room was simply decorated with great restraint. Discipline in personal and social activities. He was a model of polite restraint. A device that retards something's motion. The car did not have proper restraints fitted. A rule or condition that limits freedom. Legal restraints. The act of controlling by restraining someone or something. The unlawful restraint of trade. The act of controlling or directing according to rule. Fiscal regulations are in the hands of politicians. A principle or condition that customarily governs behavior. Short haircuts were the regulation. The act of bringing to uniformity, making regular. An authoritative rule. Embryology. The ability of an early embryo to continue normal development after its structure has been somehow damaged or altered. Prescribed by or according to regulation. Regulation Army equipment. The state of being controlled or governed. The act of controlling or directing according to rule. Linguistics. A rule describing, or prescribing, a linguistic practice. Measuring stick consisting of a strip of wood or metal or plastic with a straight edge that is used for drawing straight lines and measuring lengths. Prescribed guide for conduct or action. A principle or condition that customarily governs behavior. It was his rule to take a walk before breakfast. Exercise authority over, as of nations. Decide with authority. A rule or law concerning a natural phenomenon or the function of a complex system. The right-hand rule for inductive fields. Something regarded as a normative example. Violence is the rule, not the exception. Mathematics. A standard procedure for solving a class of mathematical problems. He determined the upper bound with Descartes' rule of signs. Be larger in number, quantity, power, status or importance. Dominance or power through legal authority. The rule of Caesar. Decide on and make a declaration about. A basic generalization that is accepted as true and that can be used as a basis for reasoning or conduct. Keep in check. Rule one's temper. Any one of a systematic body of regulations defining the way of life of members of a religious order. The rule of Saint Dominic. Directions that define the way a game or sport is to be conducted. He knew the rules of chess. Have an affinity with, of signs of the zodiac. Mark or draw with a ruler. Rule the margins. The duration of a monarch's or government's power. During the rule of Elizabeth. The act of distributing things into classes or categories of the same type. A group of people or things arranged by class or category. The basic cognitive process of arranging into classes or categories. Restriction imposed by the government on documents or weapons that are available only to certain authorized people. Law, an agreement or concession made by parties in a judicial proceeding, or by their attorneys, relating to the business before the court, must be in writing unless they are part of the court record. A stipulation of fact was made in order to avoid delay. An assumption on which rests the validity or effect of something else. A restriction that is insisted upon as a condition for an agreement. The act of circumscribing. A detailed description of design criteria for a piece of work. A restriction that is insisted upon as a condition for an agreement. Naming explicitly. Patent law. A document drawn up by the applicant for a patent of invention that provides an explicit and detailed description of the nature and use of an invention. The state of being physically constrained. A device that retards something's motion. The act of constraining. The threat or use of force to control the thoughts or behavior of others. Sudden restriction on an activity. Cutting off the electric current on certain lines when the demand becomes greater than the supply. A limitation or constraint. Taxpayers want to hold down on government spending. Change from a liquid to a solid when cold. Water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. An interruption or temporary suspension of progress or movement. A nuclear freeze. Stop a process or a habit by imposing a freeze on it. Prohibit the conversion or use of assets. Stop moving or become immobilized. Weather cold enough to cause freezing. The withdrawal of heat to change something from a liquid to a solid. Anesthetize by cold. Be cold. I could freeze to death in this office when the air conditioning is turned on. Cause to freeze. Change to ice. Fixing, of prices or wages etc., at a particular level. A freeze on hiring. Suddenly behave coldly and formally. Be very cold, below the freezing point. A limitation on the size and armament of the armed forces of a country. A limitation imposed on the variables of a proposition, as by the quantifiers, some, or, all, or, no. The act of discovering or expressing the quantity of something. A small margin. The landslide he had in the Electoral College obscured the narrowness of a victory based on just 43% of the popular vote. An inclination to criticize opposing opinions or shocking behavior. a restriction of range or scope. The problem with achievement tests is the narrowness they impose on students. The property of being narrow, having little width. The narrowness of the road.
Become our student and get access to effective and free educational materials. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to become a part of our growing YouTube community and to learn English effectively.